Welcome back. You're watching SA Today on SABC News with me, Flo Ladwaba. The new report released at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum in Singapore has found that COVID-19 pandemic has pushed an estimated 30 million people in Sub-Saharan Africa into extreme poverty, wiping out more than 5 years of progress. Whilst some ground will be made up as economies across the continent recover, this will still not be enough to meet the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals of eradicating poverty by 2030, a target that was already a stretch before the pandemic hit. To discuss this, we are now joined by Bloomberg Africa economist Boingotlo Gasealahwe. Thank you so very much for joining us, Boingotlo. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Let's go through the report and the impact of COVID-19 that has had on Africa and the SDGs. And my concern whilst looking at this report was, I'm wondering if COVID-19 is being used as a scapegoat in some instances where, those goals were perhaps unachievable without the pandemic in the first place. And maybe now this is just a great way to say, look, it's actually the pandemic that caused this. COVID-19 is the reason that we can't reach our goals. Just take us through what the report is actually saying.
Thank you so much. That's a very good question. I think if one was to summarize the results and actually respond to your comments, let's start with the question.
Yeah.
The UN Sustainable Development Goals aim to, there are a number of goals, 17, but the primary goal is to reduce or eradicate poverty by 2030. And as you correctly say, even before the pandemic, Africa was already sort of falling short of reaching that target. Why is this the case? We had growth slow down quite significantly from 2015, and that means that we're seeing the number of people sort of exit poverty is less than those who are entering poverty, and that's because the rate of growth is not sufficient enough to keep up with the rate of population growth. Then comes COVID. You have this massive income shock, which widens this gap further.
Yeah.
We expect it to persist, and the reason we expect it to persist is because, one, Africa had less fiscal resources to sort of cushion the economies or counter the effect of the virus. So you have a permanent sort of loss of income. Yes, there will be a recovery, but there are a couple of factors that will delay Africa's recovery relative to other economies. The first is our slow vaccination rate. We have less than 10% of our population vaccinated, and this compares with a global average of about 53%. The third is that we've had quite elevated debt levels, even before the pandemic, but again, the pandemic has widened this. So you're still going to be having or seeing quite elevated debt service costs, even after the effects of the pandemic fade. And so you have this persistence, really, in the rate of poverty continuing the poverty rate declines, but the number of people still in poverty is increasing throughout the decade. Yeah. And the net result is that by the end of 2050, you have about 500 million Africans living in poverty.
Yeah.
And that's 25 million more than what would have been the case had the pandemic not hit. So you are correct. It's mainly made a terrible situation worse. But the problem already existed.
Yeah. What's needed for African economies to get back on track? You can hear I'm already exacerbated just because of the fact that we've been sitting in this situation where Africa is this like problem child of sorts. We continuously get handouts and seek handouts from European nations or other nations, and then it kind of continues in that cycle. And then one wonders, even are the handouts that we call for and that we receive even helping in terms of eradicating that poverty? So one really does need to question, how is it possible? Will we ever get to a point where that poverty is eradicated, particularly on this continent?
I think it's definitely possible. It depends on how long you define the long run.
Yeah.
But if we stick to the period we've defined in our report as 2030, we think a more achievable target, still a very tall order, but a more achievable target is perhaps to say, why don't we halve the level or the rate of poverty from where it is now, and try to reduce that by 2030.
Yeah.
And doing that will require, we think, quite an extraordinary effort from the international community. Not only that, Africa would be operating within an external environment that is changing, and so it needs to be quite careful about who it looks to in terms of the support that it should require.
Yeah.
We think that China remains the obvious choice, or the nearest choice to assist. And there are two reasons for this. One, it's the biggest lender in the region. It's grown quite significantly, and its role within the G20 has grown. And secondly, its trade relations with Africa have increased also quite dramatically. In fact, they've increased fivefold. In 2000, share of trade was about 5%, and we're looking at about 20% now.
Yeah.
But more than that, China is actually looking to strengthen its relationship with the region through the Belt and Road Initiative. So we think it makes it, given its influence in the region at the moment, kind of the obvious partner to try and help for now. This doesn't mean the rest of the world can't help, but we think this is maybe a more sustainable model, as you say, that doesn't quite rely on aid.
Maybe then I should ask a two-pronged question here. Was the benchmark or the bull mark for 2030 unrealistic to begin with in terms of when we say we want to eradicate poverty? Let's just pretend the pandemic didn't happen. Was 2030 unrealistic to begin with when we're talking about eradicating poverty? And maybe I also want to ask, when we say eradicating poverty, what are we saying? What are we talking about? Are we talking about creating jobs? Are we talking about giving handouts? Because we've seen that giving handouts doesn't really eradicate poverty, does it? I mean, even in South Africa, when we're talking about, for example, people being given $350 a month, for example, even that doesn't help, it helps to a certain degree, but it doesn't eradicate poverty. So when we're talking about eradicating poverty, what exactly are we talking about?
All right, I'll go, let's say, three-layered answer.
Sure.
Was the goal achievable? It depends on whether you're asking for Africa or globally. So globally, we've seen actual poverty rates decline quite significantly, and the number of people in poverty decline. The exception here is Africa, where the number of people in poverty has actually increased. And if our projections are correct, by 2030, around 9 in 10 people around the world who are poor will be concentrated in Africa, meaning Africa will be home to the poor. Was that target achievable for Africa? I think the answer there is no, given the lack of resources that we have. But back to your question around what is it that we mean when we say, have we eradicated poverty? As I've already suggested in the beginning, the rest of the world has kind of made progress on this. But the poverty line, or when we say extreme poverty in this case, what we're referring to here is the World Bank's poverty line of $1.9. And so the debate you're actually seeing in advanced economies is that, fine, you've lifted people above that line, but people are still struggling. So the debate's going around, as you correctly say, is that the right level, and what is it that we mean about eradicating poverty? But I think for Africa, that goal, I think that line still remains quite relevant, given that we are struggling to reach it. So I think we should cross that hurdle first before we start maybe considering a higher poverty line.
All right. Boingotlo, it was a pleasure speaking to you. We hope you'll avail yourself again in future for us here at SABC News. Thank you so much for giving us your time, ma'am.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right. That is Boingotlo Gasealahwe speaking to us there about the development goals for 2030 to eradicate poverty based on the new report released by Bloomberg New Economy Forum in Singapore, finding that COVID-19 pandemic has pushed an estimated 30 million people in Sub-Saharan Africa into extreme poverty, wiping out more than 5 years of progress.